What's up guys, it's Eric from Rare Candy and welcome back to another one of our Ultra Prism deck profiles, and today we're going to be taking a look at Luxray. So this is actually the same list that we did feature in our recent testing rounds video, so if you guys want to see this deck in action, I will be sure to have a link in the description for you to check that out. And if you guys are new here to the channel and you're not familiar with those testing rounds videos that we typically post, they usually feature kind of our unrefined, rough starting points to begin testing from. So there might be some things in this list we could potentially tweak or improve upon. So just something to keep in mind as we do go through this early deck profile. So this is going to be a Luxray, of course, like I mentioned. So let's take a look at it and see why people have kind of been hyping up this archetype. So first up, this is a Luxray deck, so we need Shinx. And we are playing one of the new Shinx from Ultra Prism. It has this ability, and actually at the time of filming, the English official translation has not come out, and I have seen multiple translations for this, but the most popular one that I've seen is the one where if you go second on your first turn, you can evolve Shinx basically right into Luxio. And that is kind of, like I said, the most popular translation I've seen. So like I said, something to keep in mind. We don't have the official translation, but I do believe that is the correct one. So we're going to play that one, of course, because that means we can get Luxio into play a little bit quicker. And the reason we want to do that is because Luxio is actually kind of the most important part of the deck, as weird as that sounds. So Luxio is the stage 1. You know, you might be in, it only has 80 hit points, you know, 1 attack. It only does 30 damage, so what is the big deal? And the reason, you know, Luxio is so important is because it does 30 damage, but for a single energy, doesn't matter what type, your opponent can't play any item cards. So this is essentially a one prize version of Seismitoad EX. Like I said, just reprinted on a stage 1 that only gives up 1 prize. So, you know, like I said, it's just like that old Quaking Punch attack. You're doing 60 damage if you have a choice band. But, you know, that's honestly, I think, pretty bad as far as winning a game. You know, your opponent can't play item cards, but at the end of the day, you're still just an 80 hit point Pokemon. So we need a way to actually deal with that. And the way we're going to go about that is actually with Luxray. So Luxray, of course, is the stage 2 version. And Luxray actually has a lot going for him. Has 150 hit points, so that alone is a massive increase over Luxio. And it also has an ability, if it's your active Pokemon, it takes 30 less damage from your opponent's attacks. So effectively you have 180 hit point, 1 prize attacker, which is great. Also has free retreat, which means you're always going to have a Pokemon to promote whenever you play Guzma that you can just retreat out of. So that's already pretty good. And it does have an attack as well. For 2 lightning and a colorless, does 150 damage to one of your opponent's Pokemon, but you have to discard all of your lightning energy. And if you're not too familiar with this archetype yet, you might be thinking, that sounds terrible. Why would you want to play this? There's not like really much good form of lightning acceleration. And the reason we are, you know, talking about Luxray with Luxio is because we have Shining Celebi. So we're playing 2 Shining Celebi, has that time recall ability. Each of your evolved Pokemon can use attacks of their previous evolutions, but of course you still need the correct energy to use those attacks. Which means if we have Shining Celebi in play, we can actually copy Luxio's attack with Luxray and have a lot more HP in the process. And also potentially access to an alternate attack as well. So I think that is definitely what's going to make this archetype a lot stronger because, like I said, Luxio on his own is not very impressive. His attack is certainly annoying, but you know, even just something like a lone Tapu Lele GX can you know, have no problem picking off Luxios if need be. So like I said, we definitely need a much better way to keep this lot going, and playing Luxray is going to help ensure that. So next up, we do have another attacker in the deck, and that is going to be 1 Cobalion. So we're looking at Cobalion for Revenge Blast. For 2 metal energy, you do 30 plus 30 more for every prize card your opponent has taken. And you guys might be thinking, well, Cobalion takes metal energy. Are you sure this is in the right deck? And yes, I am sure. So we do play counter energy in this list, which we'll talk more about in a little bit. But counter energy will enable us to attack with Cobalion for just a single attachment. Also will enable us to attack with Luxray's second attack, or I guess second attack, considering Luxio's is probably your primary attack. Because otherwise these attacks are kind of problematic to get going, and you definitely need a way to clean up knockouts, because just doing 30 damage with Luxio's attack is not great. Yes, with Choice Band you do 60, but unlike Seismitoad EX of the past, we don't have access to, you know, like the Crobat line or the Hypnotoxic Laser Burbank City Gym combo that was, seen play in so many Seismitoad decks. So we definitely need a way to clean up knockouts with this deck, and Cobalion is just another way to do that. So that's why we're running it. Next up, we're also playing one copy of Marshadow. This is definitely another interesting inclusion. So we're playing it for its ability, Let Loose. Whenever you play Marshadow from your hand onto your bench, both players shuffle their hands into their deck and draw 4 cards. So a few reasons that we're playing this. The first reason is that this deck just requires a lot of moving pieces to really get going. Honestly, if you don't get 2 Luxio out on your second turn, I think this deck is in a terrible spot, because usually your first Luxio gets knocked out no matter what, just because it only has 80 hit points. And then you need to be able to evolve your second Luxio into Luxray on the following turn. So sometimes, whenever you bridge it, you might only have 1 Luxio in hand. I'm using the example if you're going second and, trying to get out a couple Shinx and Luxio. So sometimes you can't successfully bridge it out your Shinx and get multiple Luxios into play at a time. So Marshadow gives us a way to dig through our deck a little bit. Since we don't have access to something like Shaman EX in the current format, Marshadow is kind of our only really way to really dig and try to hit what we need sometimes. So that's like the one use that it has, but the other use that it has is for just the disruption aspect of the card. Being able to shuffle your opponent's hand into their deck and ensure that they only get 4 cards is very powerful, especially in a deck that, has a way of locking your opponent's item cards. So especially in the first couple turns of the game, if you are having to dig to get out maybe 2 Luxios or, whatever you need for the turn to really get going, being able to item lock your opponent and put their hand down at a low hand size, while they still have a lot of cards in their deck, is very, very powerful. So it's just another way of drawing cards in the deck. And then to round out the Pokemon line, of course, it's just 2 copies of Tapu Lele GX for that Wonder Tag ability. Search supporters out of our deck whenever we bench Tapu Lele. And we actually do run 1 Psychic Energy in this deck, which we'll touch on later, for Tapu Cure GX, since we don't really have a GX move that we can abuse. So for a single Psychic Energy, heal all damage from 2 of your bench Pokemon. So hopefully you aren't in a position that you have to use Tapu Cure, but like I said, we will have the option in this list at the least. So going on to our trainer cards, we have 3 copies of the new supporter card Cynthia. You shuffle your hand into your deck and draw 6 cards. Just a nice form of shuffle draw, just to help get us set up. We don't have to discard resources with Sycamore. In this deck especially, we have a lot of moving pieces. We have this thick Luxray line. Then we also have a lot of, kind of reactionary item cards and stuff like that, which we'll mention. So things like Enhanced Hammer and Max Potion, stuff like that, just aren't cards that you really want to get rid of with Sycamore. So that's why, we're kind of favoring a heavier count of Cynthia here. Next up, though, we are still playing 3 copies of N. So each player shuffles their hand into their deck, draws equal to the amount of prize cards they have left. This deck usually always goes down on prizes first, in my experience. And so having something like N to kind of keep your opponent in check and, disrupt them while you're mounting a comeback can be very good. And then, of course, 2 copies of Professor Sycamore just to round out the supporter count. Like I said, we don't really want to play a thick count because there are a lot of moving pieces in this deck. But, it's still a very, very powerful form of draw support. So that's why we're still playing it. Next up, we're playing a new card from Ultra Prism. That's going to be Volkner. And actually, I have to be honest, this is a card I initially threw in the list on a whim. I did not expect to really like it. I wasn't too optimistic about it in our set review. I kind of said it was okay. But honestly, every time I found myself playing this card in this deck, it's been pretty good. So it lets you get a lightning energy out of your deck and an item card. So this is nice because we can sometimes search your deck for the energy that we need to attack, and then maybe a means of searching out one of our Pokemon to actually attack with it. But then we also play a bunch of item cards that are worth grabbing in this deck. So we do play Max Potion, like I briefly mentioned. So if our opponent swings on Luxray and does a bunch of damage, we can play Volkner, grab Max Potion to heal off all the damage, and after we discard the energy, we can attach the lightning energy that we grabbed with Volkner as well. So there's lots of interesting combos that this card enables. Like I said, I expect it to actually not be very good, but I've actually been enjoying it so far in my experience. So next up, we have 3 copies of Guzma to choose what we want to take knockouts on. And actually, this is a card I'm debating cutting down to a lower count of, maybe even in place of Counter Catcher. That is an option I do want to try out in this deck, just because this deck always goes down on prizes in my experience, like I mentioned. So maybe Counter Catcher could be a little bit better here, but just something I wanted to mention, but something I haven't tried out yet. And then, of course, to round out our supporters, 2 copies of Bridget, just to search Pokemon, out of our deck, get them in play so we can start evolving into our Luxios as quick as possible. So up next for item cards, of course, 4 copies of Ultra Ball, search Pokemon out of our deck. But then we are playing 1 copy of Nest Ball. So it's an item card, lets you search your deck for a basic Pokemon, put it onto your bench. And then also 1 copy of Timer Ball. So flip 2 coins for each head, search your deck for an evolution, and put it into your hand. So a couple reasons why we're playing these. First of all, this deck needs a lot to really get going. I honestly think on the first turn of the game you need 3 Shinx, and on turn 2 you need at least 2 Luxios for this deck to really have a chance, I think. And so sometimes you just don't have that. So playing these extra ball cards just gives you more outs to, ensuring that your deck can just survive the early turns of the game, which is going to be a big hurdle, I think, for Luxray just in general. But a couple other reasons we're playing these, they are Volkner targets. So that means we can just play Volkner and grab exactly what we need and get an energy as well. So kind of how some decks in the past that played Karina would play like one of item cards that Karina could grab. We're playing kind of the same type of thing in this deck too. Next up, we're playing 3 copies of Choice Band just to increase our quite terrible, pitiful damage output that we have. So being able to hit for 60 with Luxio's attack is going to be very, very important here. Also, it actually matters for the math for for Luxray's attack. So it does 150, but with the Choice Band, you can do 180. So that means if they have something like a Volcanion EX or a Tapu Lele GX in the active, you can just knock them out in 1 hit. And Choice Band's also very nice because under item lock, your opponent can't Field Blower you. So definitely a very good card. Next up, 2 copies of Float Stone just to give our Pokemon free retreat. So, luckily our Luxray does have free retreat, but in the early portion of the game, if we are unfortunate enough to start with something like a Cobalion or a Marshadow or something else other than Shinx, we want to have a way to quickly get that Pokemon out of the active spot and start item locking our opponent, hopefully on, even as early as turn 1 if we go second. So next up we have 2 copies of Enhanced Hammer, discard a special energy from one of your opponent's Pokemon. So Enhanced Hammer is such a good card in the current metagame. We have double Carlos energy being played in seemingly almost every popular deck these days. Outside of Volcanion, I think most decks are going to have some sort of special energy for you to discard. So that definitely seems good and, kind of like a disruptive deck like this. Also, since our damage output is low, we need to strip resources away from our opponent to ensure that they can't knock us out, while we're chipping away at them with these kind of mediocre, damage outputting attacks. So next up, 2 copies of Max Potion, like I mentioned earlier, and we're playing this because Luxray and Luxio only need 1 single energy to attack, which is, I think, makes Max Potion a natural partner for these types of Pokemon, because if, let's say, someone does attack into Luxray, you can Max Potion, you have to discard all of your energy, but then luckily you only need 1 more energy to keep using Luxio's attack. So Max Potion, again, another card I think that has some natural synergy here. Also good against things like Buzzwole GX that do bench damage. Granted, I think this deck loses pretty hard to any Buzzwole deck, but at least there is the option to stay alive a few more turns if you choose to. So that's why we're playing Max Potion. 1 copy of Field Blower to discard our opponent's tool cards in stadiums. I think a lot of decks typically favor 2 copies of Field Blower, but since we're item locking our opponent, I don't think you even need the extra copy because they inherently can't play down their tools to begin with since we are item locking them. So the 1 copy I think is really all you need here. So next up we have 1 copy of Rescue Stretcher and 1 copy of Super Rod. Those are going to be our recovery options, and this is actually a deck I would even debatably play a third or a second copy of one of these cards, just because you constantly need to stream your Luxrays and Luxios, and sometimes that can be a little bit difficult throughout the course of a game, but so far 2 has been working okay. So we're playing the split just because they each have different perks to them. So Rescue Stretcher, of course, allows us the flexibility of getting a Pokemon directly back into our hand, whereas Super Rod gives us the flexibility of getting back basic energy, which we do run in this list. So that's why we're playing the split of these, but like I said, you might even, if you can find room for another one, I wouldn't even mind that either. So next up, 2 copies of Perilous City. That is going to round out our trainer cards. So Perilous City, just in general, I think is an immensely strong card in this format. well, I should say the current format at the time of filming, the Crimson Invasion format. We'll have to see how Ultra Prism is going to do, of course. But yeah, definitely one of my favorite cards for the Crimson Invasion format, because whichever side the blue side of Perilous City is facing, that player can only have 3 bench Pokemon, which is so strong, especially in a deck that can lock your opponent's item cards. So if you can get down Perilous City, that's just in general a strong stadium to have in play. But when you combine that with the fact that your opponent can't Field Blower it away thanks to item lock, it just makes it that much stronger. And like I've mentioned a couple different times, this is a disruption kind of deck, so Perilous City definitely does a good job at that. So next up for our energy cards, we are playing 4 copies of Counter Energy, which I briefly mentioned earlier. So it's a special energy. It provides 1 colorless energy by default, but if your opponent has fewer prize cards remaining than you, it provides 2 energy of any kind at the same time, but only for non-EX and GX Pokemon. So that means if we are losing, which you usually do in the early game, or the early to mid game with this deck, I would say, Counter Energy is basically a double Rainbow Energy, which is great because it enables something like Cobalion to come back and sweep your opponent. Also allows us to use Luxray's attack. So that's why we are playing it, and since Luxio doesn't require any specific energy to use its attack, we can just throw it down even in the early game when maybe neither player is taking a prize, and use it to fulfill the item locking attack as well. So next up for the rest of the energy, this is going to look kind of weird, but bear with me here. So we have 2 copies of Lightning Energy, which seems like it makes some sense. We play Lightning Pokemon, but honestly the only reason I'm even playing Lightning Energy is because we are playing Volkner. Honestly, if you don't like Volkner and you want to cut Lightning Energy, there's no point to it, because Luxray's attack discards Lightning Energy, and Counter Energy will provide the 2 that you need. So it's actually better to have different types attached to Luxray anyways. But like I said, since we're playing Volkner, it's too good not to play at least a few Lightning Energies. And so for the rest of these, we are playing 2 copies of Metal Energy and then 1 Psychic Energy. So the Metal Energy is obviously to fulfill Cobalion's attack cost, and the Psychic Energy will allow us to use Tapu Cure. And you might be thinking, well, these are kind of like, very thin counts, you might not draw into them. And while that's true, if we do have to discard them or something like that, we do have the option of getting them back with Super Rod as well. So I do think that's an option. Another thing I think some people might initially try to gravitate towards if they're going to build off of this list, they might try Unit Energy, which provides Lightning, Metal, and Psychic, but I would recommend against that too, just because Unit Energy does provide Lightning Energy, which Luxray would have to discard. So like I said, if you don't like Volkner, cut the Lightning Energy and play, I would say, exclusively some combination, or just exclusively one of these 2 types. That seems like the best route to go. So yeah, definitely a weird energy count, but it all kind of makes sense though at the same time. But yeah guys, that's going to be pretty much it for our Luxray deck profile that we have here. Definitely seems like an interesting deck, and is definitely an archetype I want to keep an eye on, but I think initially at the release of Ultra Prism, I think this deck has some pretty big obstacles it's going to have to overcome if it wants to cement itself in the metagame. But like I said, definitely has a lot of interesting things going on for it. The counter energies make this deck, I think, kind of interesting. Gives you some options for some different, support Pokemon. So maybe there's even some things that we didn't include in this list that we can try out as well using counter energy. But definitely, like I said, an archetype I want to keep an eye out on in the future. But yeah, guys, definitely stay tuned to the channel, because we're going to have a ton more Ultra Prism coverage lined up on the channel over the next several weeks. So definitely stay tuned for the rest of the videos that we have coming. But as usual, feel free to like and subscribe. And if you can support our channel by becoming a patron over at patreon.com/rarecandytcg, big shout out to all of our patrons over there, or by picking up something from our online store at rarecandytcg.com, it would mean a lot to us. But with that, I appreciate you watching, and we'll see you for the next one.